Ballard, Associate Director here at the Dole Institute of Politics for Civic Programming and Outreach. And I'll join Lori and welcome you and tell you how pleased we are that you are friends of the Dole Institute of Politics. It is my pleasure this evening to introduce to you Mark Zwonitzer. Boy, that name gets me all the time. Zwonitzer. Mark, boy, to say it, Mark.
Zwonitzer.
Zwonitzer. I've said it 3 times today and 20 yesterday.
It's too many Z's.
Too many Z's. Zwonitzer is an author and filmmaker whose work over the past 25 years has covered the politics, wars, arts, literature, and sports of America's past and present. I will also tell you that this afternoon we had pizza and politics at the Alumni Association for our students, and we had over 30 of our students attend to hear about him. And we do that when we bring in our guests sometimes so that the students have an opportunity to meet a professional that they may want to emulate later on and ask questions. For the last 18 years, Zwonitzer has produced, directed, and written award-winning programming for PBS, including Walt Whitman, for which he received Primetime Emmy nominations for Outstanding Achievement in Nonfiction Filmmaking and Outstanding Achievement in Writing. Zwonitzer's first book, Will You Miss Me When I'm Gone? The Carter Family and Their Legacy in American Music, which was in 2002, was the New York Times Notable Book of the Year. Zwonitzer, a native of Emporia, Kansas, grew up in Kansas. I heard somebody go, Grew up in Kansas and Missouri and graduated from the University of Missouri School of Journalism. I was waiting for that one. That's why I made a comment on the first one. He is currently at work on a book about the eventful final years of the lives of the 2 most accomplished men to have sprouted from the banks of the Missouri River, which would be John Hay and Mark Twain. Bill Lacey, director of the Dole Institute of Politics, will interview Mark this evening, and I'm sure you'll find more things about Mark that are very exciting and will make us very proud that he's from the state of Kansas. Thank you very much.
Mark, welcome to the Dole Institute. Tell us how you got started in writing, researching, kind of what took you into that career. What was your kind of motivation?
I think actually it was a default setting for me, which is to say I finished high school in Columbia, Missouri, and the journalism school was right around the corner from me. And the idea in my family is that you do something practical. And I knew I had no particular facility for making money, a suspicion which has been borne out over my 25-year career. And so journalism seemed like the place to go. I knew I could write, I loved to read, and I was headed toward I was a news ed major. I was a terrible newspaper man. I had no news judgment at all. A friend of mine once said, you know, if there was a second coming of Christ, you would probably run a correction in the obituaries. So I actually ended up in magazines right out of school. I went to Esquire magazine in New York, and I met a fellow who's, his name is Richard Ben Kramer, and I think he's been here, Richard. Mm-hmm. And Richard and I became his researcher on a book about the '88 presidential campaign called What It Takes. Bob Dole is, as you know, a big part of that book. And so I spent 6 years with Richard doing that, which was a great apprenticeship for becoming an author. And after that, we were asked by a filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker, to help him do a film he was working on. And I said, I'd be happy to help you, but I would like you to show me how you make these films. And so I got an apprenticeship like that. It was really being thrown feet first into the fire. You know, I can't say that I had a path ever planned, but doors just sort of opened up, and I was able to walk through them. And what's great about being able to go back and forth between books and film is that the process is very different. Books are, it's a very lonely thing. You're in your room tapping away at your computer, and the film is much more collaborative. You get to work with actors, and you get to work with composers and editors and a lot of different people. So and I kind of toggle back and forth between the two. Can I tell you one reason I'm really happy to be here is that Richard and I have been working together now for 25 years or more, and we have done a lot of different things together and covered a lot of different subjects and a lot of different people. But every time Richard calls me to this day, I'll pick up the phone and I'll hear, "What's cooking? How's it looking?" It's just a Bob Dole line, And when it's time to go, it's, "Okay, gotta go." To this day, Bob Dole remains I would say the most interesting character we've ever run across.
Let's talk about that a little bit more, because I think everybody here at one time or another has heard me say that What It Takes is the definitive book on politics, on especially political character, presidential character. And basically, I think that's where you guys were headed with your title, What It Takes to be president. How did you wind up working on that? You said you got that job, but tell us a little bit of the detail, how you wound up working with Richard Ben Cramer on that book.
Well, I met Richard at Esquire magazine. He was doing a piece about Ted Williams, and I helped him with that. And I actually, this is a little bit of a strange aside, but I was in another friend's apartment visiting in New York, and I met this woman I'd never met before, and she said, "Did you guys hear about Richard? He signed up this big book about the presidential campaign." And I said, "Wow, Richard, I like Richard, and he's a great writer, and he's going to need help on that." So I started calling him and saying, "Richard, you're going to need a researcher, and it's going to have to be me." And eventually he got tired of taking the calls, and he hired me. But the odd thing is that soon after we started working on it, the same woman who I had met moved to Washington to go to work at the Washington Post, and we were all sort of sharing a group house together, and we ended up getting married and having 2 children. So What It Takes is like the story of my life.
What exactly was your role in the book? Did you do mostly research? Did you go out and interview people, or what?
I did a lot of the research, and I did a lot of the reporting, but Richard did 70-80% of the reporting and talking to people, and I was always adding to. And one of the things I did was that I put together these with his reporting and his research and his interviews and my interviews, and they numbered into the thousands. I put together for every chapter what we called the Bible, which was a book about 1,200 pages for each chapter, laid out a chronology of what the structure of the book was going to be. So I was sort of helping in structuring the narrative at that point too. And those books are still they're still extant. Richard has them in his. They're pretty musty. I've seen them. They're more than 20 years old. And about a month ago, he called me up and he said a bunch of young political reporters came out to have dinner with him and sit at his feet and talk about him. And he pulled these big Bibles out to show them, and they held them in their hands like they were some sort of religious relics, My God, there's a quote in here from Paul Tully, and, Walt Riker, Scott Richardson. So that's what I did. I also did other weird things, like now Richard won a Pulitzer Prize at 29, and he was a man who knew what he was doing and was not short of confidence. He'd won a Pulitzer for international reporting, but he was very humble about what he didn't know. When we walked into this book, we decided basically we knew nothing about anybody, and we had to learn everything from the ground up, and that's what we did. But I wasn't sure how much I was going to be able to contribute. And one of the first trips we made out here was to Russell. And we left a day in New York, which was pretty spring-like, about 65 degrees. And we flew to Kansas City. and somewhere west of Topeka, it got to be winter. And we started hearing on the radio stories about like cows freezing in the field. And we got to Salina, and they'd closed the highway. And it was the middle of the night, so we pulled off at the Holiday Inn in Salina, and Richard goes storming in there to get a room. You know, he's sort of an aggressive New York guy. And he comes out and says, you know, they have no room. We have to go and sleep at the Y. So, well, Richard, maybe your approach wasn't the one we want to take. So I went to the desk and said, you know, we're kind of stuck and we have no, and the woman says, now, are you with the church choir? And I said, no, ma'am, but if we have to sing for a room, we will. And they did take us at the Holiday Inn in Salina. So, you know, those were some of my other duties, smoothing Richard's path in western Kansas.
I'm sure you never let Richard forget that either, did
No.
you? So, excellent. Let me ask you one more question about What It Takes, because it's really a unique book. How many of you have read this? I want to know by a show of hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, a few of you.
It's a good doorstop, too, you know.
Yeah, well, it's a huge book. But what is so fascinating is what you said about Bob Dole's. You guys got in his head. Anybody, and Scott and Scott over there will tell you this. Anybody who knows Bob Dole knows that these guys you really got all inside his head. You really knew what motivated the guy, what made him tick and everything. And it's not a Teddy White style Making the President book. It's really a unique book on a presidential campaign. But how did you guys kind of come to it? What you said just a few minutes ago, you kind of started with a notion. You didn't know anything, so you had to like go and research it all. Is that why the book turned out the way it did?
That was part of the reason. I mean, we didn't accept any of the conventional wisdom because we didn't know it. I mean, we didn't know enough to know what we didn't know. But the idea of the book was always to understand the process through the eyes of the people running. Not from the outside, but what it felt like to be in the middle of it. So also, What It Takes was sort of we always thought of it as a double-edged sword. It's what it takes to be president, but what the process takes from you, because it's a very grueling process, and it's not always fun. And I have subsequently spent a lot of time with Senator and now Vice President Biden, and his life was really turned upside down by that campaign and mistakes he made in it, which he's obviously climbed out of and just done just fine for himself. But so I think we were pretty successful and it wasn't. It was a lot of hard work, and it was a lot of going around and talking to a lot of people who'd been in the room and who'd seen and who knew. And so by the time we got to the candidates, and we didn't usually have a lot of time with them, but by the time we got to the candidates, I think we were talking about things that most other people weren't talking about and asking them things that other folks weren't saying. I will say the one thing I'm really pleased about is Biden told me about 6 months ago that he and Dole were on a trip to Bosnia during the worst of the conflict there, and Biden actually asked Dole about the book. He said, "What'd you think of it?" Because Biden was one of the big guys in the book, and Dole said to him, "Well, I didn't like everything they wrote, but they got it right," and that had been Biden's feeling too. He actually, it's the weirdest thing. He actually said, I learned something about myself reading the book. So that was, it was heartening in that way. We also, we also sent the chapters to the candidates and sent the chapters and read everything to people who helped us with the book.
I remember proofing a lot of the sections of Richard Ben Kramer's interviews with me. So.
Yeah, and we would call people up and read them pages right out of the book, and it was a book that it wasn't a gotcha book. It was a what's it like to be you book.
You apparently got along very well with the vice president because he asked you to write his biography.
Yeah, I helped him write his memoir, his
Right.
autobiography.
Yeah. What was that experience like?
Well, that was, I was so busy doing so many other things, and he really hauled me into the boat. I didn't. He's a charming and interesting and fun guy. And what would happen is I would show up at his house in Wilmington. I'd take a train early from New York. I'd show up about 9 in the morning. We did this like 2-3 days a month over 3 years. And I would show up in the morning, and he would start talking and talking and talking. But by the way, he's a fantastic storyteller, and he thinks in narrative terms, and he remembers, meetings and everything he sees. And it was just a lot of fun. But often what would happen, and he really is people can get caught up in being a United States senator or vice president or whatever it is. They go in the bubble, as we describe it in the book. He worked very hard to live a life that he felt was normal. He went home to Wilmington every night. Usually when I showed up, there would be some task to do. Mark, let's talk on the road because I have to go pick up some sod. So we'd go to the nursery and we'd pick up sod, and we'd go to, and here would be Joe Biden in a pickup that wasn't big enough to carry the sod. So the back of the pickup was, there were sparks coming off the tailpipe along the main drag in Wilmington, and everybody knows him in Wilmington. So we come to a stoplight, and a guy rolls down the window and says, "Senator, green side up." Okay, buddy, yeah. The other thing I loved about Biden that people don't probably know about him is that when I would spend a day with him, I would always walk out of his house feeling like I was in a better mood. And things are going to be okay, Okay, so, hey, Mark, there are problems, but it's going to be all right, And I really think that that's a very useful thing to have a few doors down from the Oval Office, you can, it's a tough job, and it's a lot of weight to carry. And I'm not saying that, I think there's something in him that's it's genetic. I mean, it's temperament. And I was telling these students earlier this morning that a lot of these people, men and women, who rise to that level in politics, they all have this incredible engine. They just don't stop. They go all day long, and they basically think everything's gonna work out. I'm not cynical at all about. I mean, it's easy to be these days, I guess, but I'm not cynical at all about the people who hold elective office and who are doing our business every day. I think they're all trying to do the best they can. I don't think anybody wants us to be any less prosperous or any less safe. They're just going about it different, from different directions. And some of that I learned in talking to Biden and learning about his 30 plus years in the Senate.
How did you get involved in the documentaries? How did that transpire, and which was the first one that you did?
Well, again, the guy asked me to come in and help with film in 1996 about, 92. It was about George Herbert Walker Bush and Bill Clinton. And I said, yeah, but please, I'd like to learn how you do this. And he actually brought me into the company, and the first film I did with him was about the Battle of the Bulge. It was the 50-year anniversary of that battle, and that was it was a really fascinating experience. It was these men, they were. So this was 1994. It was 50 years. So they were in their late 60s, early 70s. They were getting on, and many of them had never spoken about their war experiences, even with their own families. So in some cases, like the floodgates would open up. There was one man in South Dakota who he had been a 17-year-old. He enlisted at 17. He trained for about 90 days, and he was shipped and plugged into the line as a replacement soldier in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge. And it's a very dramatic story, and I really wanted him to be somebody on camera who told his story. And I went out to South Dakota. This poor man, I moved in with him for like 3 days. I just wouldn't leave, and we sat and we talked and we talked and we talked. And, part of it was trying to convince him to come on in front of the camera and tell his story, but part of it was just sitting and being in the room and talking to him and hearing his experience. And I lost him. He didn't ever come on camera with me, but what he told me informs almost every frame of the film. So nothing is ever wasted in these films. There's what you see is sort of the tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot of work that goes on beneath that, or I hope there is. At least in my work, I try to make sure that there is that.
What was so compelling about his story? Why were you so focused on getting him to go on, and then you said it kind of informed every frame of the film?
Well, he didn't, because he was a replacement soldier and tossed into the middle of the line, he didn't really have pals in the unit, so it was a very lonely experience for him. In fact, they had these replacement depots, they called them, but if you were a soldier being plugged in, you knew them as the Reppel-Deppels. You went through the Reppel-Deppel, he was plugged into the 17th Airborne. And the guy who was sort of assigning everybody into their different units, middle level officer said to them, and remember these 18-year-old kids, he said, most of y'all aren't coming back. Might as well get used to it now. So, welcome to war, gentlemen. And so that's, now it's equally true that there were a dozen other, gentlemen who had very compelling stories to tell and did. And there was something about him being so quiet about it, TV is a medium, especially in film, where the big personality can sort of take over. And I've always liked the kind of quiet person. They just feel a little more believable. He wasn't selling himself, he just sort of wanted to help tell the story.
Mm-hmm. Now, most of the documentaries, were you approached by somebody to do the writing for them, or did somebody come to you and say, will you make this film? Or did it work the other way around? Did you go to somebody and say, I know you need a writer, or I'd like to make this film, or whatever?
Well, most of the work I've done over the last 18 years, I guess, has been for the American Experience series. I've done some other things, so I had a pretty strong relationship with them, and we would go back and forth, and there would sort of be an array of ideas that they were interested in, and then I would try to sell them on my ideas, and so I batted about 300 getting my ideas through. Usually I ended up doing theirs, but they were, if I had a choice, I would say, I think I'll take the story in Hawaii instead of the story about Jesse James for now. Yeah. But a few that, Joe DiMaggio, which was a film I did with Richard also, was one that we pushed through. Walt Whitman was one that I really wanted to do, and I got a lot of resistance from them about that, about doing a poet, for God's sakes. Why would you do a poet? But managed to get that through, and was very happy with that film.
Which would you say is your favorite, if you had to pick one?
Yeah,
or your two or three favorites?
Who's my favorite child? I like the Whitman film a lot. That film means a lot to me. The Battle of the Bulge film, which was the first I ever did, means a lot to me because I think that's something that will stand the test of time, I believe. I'll tell you one really fun film that I did was the making of the Transcontinental Railroad, and I didn't think it was going to be very fun going in, but man, if you're worried about like a little bit of corruption in government right now, I mean, they're passing out stock on the Senate floor, to the railroad. The great character in the railroad was a guy named Thomas C. Durant who ran the Union Pacific. He started running the Union Pacific, and they started the Union Pacific, as everybody knows, in Omaha. Well, the first thing he did, because they were getting paid by the mile, was that he made this big oxbow of like 60 miles, like that, for no reason, just because he was going to make more money, like that. And that ended up being a lot of fun, and a big history, because you also have in the West that Central Pacific was built by mainly Chinese labor, and you walk into the tunnels that they dug through there, and it's unbelievable. And so, the thanks of a grateful nation was the Exclusionary Act to keep Chinese out of the country. But things worked out eventually. But that was a great story, and we drove back and forth across the line many times. We would go for sometimes the old line is off the highway, so we would go for 2 or 3 days without ever seeing another human being. And you could still see there are these divots out there off the main where the grade was. These divots out there where these guys had been living, 130 years ago, 140 years ago. They would have tents up, and they dug themselves in the hills in Utah or Wyoming or somewhere. It was, an amazing feat. And a feat of, it was so American, because it's so big and so remarkable and so spectacular and so greedy and so corrupt and so fun. And, all these things makes for great stories.
Which one would you say was the most challenging, the most difficult to either research, write, or actually make the film?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you which was the most intellectually, I won't use that. The most challenging in terms of the material was I did a 4-hour series about the Supreme Court, the court from soup to nuts, from the Constitutional Convention right up through today, and that was, going to law school for a couple of years. That was dreadful. Really? You want to go to sleep thinking about states' rights tonight? But it was also a lot of fun and fascinating. I'll tell you this one. If you got a minute, I'll tell you a story about. This relates to the court. It also relates to in this business, and what's so fun about it is you get to do a lot of different things and meet a lot of different people, and there are weird connections that happen. And I went to Arizona to interview Sandra Day O'Connor. This is shortly after she had left the court. And she was wonderful. She was very candid about her fears being the first woman to be on the court, and about, if I don't do a good job, is this going to mean no other woman is going to, she felt a big burden, and she was great, and she was wonderful. We interviewed her at the courthouse where there's a statue of Sandra Day O'Connor, and I said, I've interviewed a lot of people in a lot of places, but never one who had a statue in the building. She said, I know, but don't you think my hands and feet are disproportionately large? Yes, I do. Terrible sculptor. I don't know what they could have been thinking. But so you're sitting around and you're talking to other people in the room, and I was talking to someone who had been doing security for her, and I was just asking about odd stories. He said, we were at the Kennedy Center, and Kid Rock, who was this wild, crazy, Detroit rock and roll guy, came up and said he really wanted to meet the justice. So we took him back into the back room and introduced him, and Kid Rock, hey, you know. And he walks out, and she says, now who was that? So, cut to a couple of years later, I was at a memorial service where it was not a service, it was a big concert memorializing this guy named Ahmet Ertegun, who ran Atlantic Records. And a friend of mine who was, if you know Sam and Dave and Soul Man, he was the Sam of Sam and Dave. And he was performing with Kid Rock at this. They were doing a duet. So afterwards, we were back in the dressing room, and it was like, you know, I can't help but ask, you know. So I said to Kid Rock, I said, hey, by the way, Sandra Day O'Connor says hi. And he kind of looks at me, and then he turns to walk away, and he sort of scratches his chin, and he says, you know, I only met her that once at the Kennedy Center. And he was really pleased that, you know, she remembered. So it's I run into odd things in my professional career.
I bet. Well, I am going to get one more question, then we're going to open it up to your questions and answers. So, Lori, I don't know if our cordless mics were covered on that. Okay, good. Tyler and Andrew are on the case. Last question for you, Mark. Give us kind of a preview of coming attractions. Barbara mentioned what you're working on. Tell us a little bit about that, what you're doing, kind of the process that you go through.
I actually am working on something that it is in a process right now. I'm fascinated by John Hay, who he is a man who was Lincoln's private secretary during the Civil War, and then was McKinley and Roosevelt's Secretary of State. And he was really the ambassador. He was the ambassador to the Court of St. James, and then the Secretary of State when, you know, America really became something quite different, what it is today. You know, coming out of the Spanish-American War, when you know what happened was, oh my God, you know, I think we might own the Philippines. And so I've always been fascinated in that period. And as I started doing the research, another name kept popping up, a guy I always loved and wanted to write about, was Mark Twain. And it turns out they were friends. From 1867, they were great buddies. And so I'm trying to see if I can make a book out of not their relationship, but their different set of eyes on this really cataclysmic time period that happened. But I actually would like to read you something I just found in an archive a couple of days ago. I think I shoved this in my pocket on the way out. You know, you run across weird letters, things you never expected to see. So I come across a letter from Twain to John Hay in 1899 when Hay was the Secretary of State. And one thing you have to know about Twain is he was always on the make. He was always broke, and he was always trying to make money, and he was always losing money, and he was always in some new thing. So he writes a letter. He's living in Vienna, and he writes to John Hay, Dear Excellency, now then listen. For a year off and on, I've been thinking about a simple scheme for the betterment of the post office revenue, and now it is finished and for sale. If it were a new and particularly comprehensive way of killing Christians, I know the War Department would buy the idea. But I know the governments have sometimes bought ideas of purely commercial value. I only want the government to issue and sell a thing which is as simple as a postcard and pay me a royalty of 1% on the sales for 12 years. The government would derive other revenues from this scheme, but in those I could not share. He asks Hay to get the government to agree to have a look at the thing. And he says, you know, I'm sorry to bother an overworked man in this way. I'm very sorry indeed, but honestly, I don't know any way to help it. Hay obviously answered him back. He answered him. I haven't found that letter, and I don't know what he said exactly, but there's a letter a couple months later from Twain. This is only a line to thank you. It was fine of you to do that for me when your hands are so full. I'm going to let the post office department rest and strengthen up until I come in the fall. And meantime, I will arrange to make myself the pet of the War Department. I am perfecting a scheme whereby I can cheaply and thoroughly exhaust the life principle of the atmosphere and instantly kill the massed armies of the world and every living thing within a radius of 300,000 miles around them. And by the way, I happen to know this is an idea he also had recently shared with the Austrian emperor. He even had a man in mind to do it. Right? He goes on. In fact, I'm already able to do this. I've made all the preparations and was expecting to touch the button and abolish the race this afternoon as an experiment, but must postpone it and think further, for I do not know what to do with my family. Thanks again, Samuel L. Clemens. I mean, I have no idea if I'm going to use that in any way. I don't know what's the point or what to make of it, but it's fun to run across that stuff, you know.
Okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I wish that the people dealing with the big issues of the day were getting that sort of loosen you up correspondence every day. You know, I want to keep them loose and relaxed, and I'm glad he had correspondence like Twain in the middle of all this.
Okay. Let's do your Q&A, Tyler. If you want to start searching people out, I think you guys all know the rules, so. We don't have to repeat one question, wait for the microphone, one question, no filibustering.
And don't throw anything at me if you don't like the answer.
Yes. First of all, well, one question. One question is, do most of your films become books that we can buy, or can we get them on DVD? And you must use the Twain stuff. And are you worried about email and losing letters in the future?
Yeah. Yes.
It's very skillfully done, too, I might say.
All the films are available with the exception of the Joe DiMaggio film. That's not available, but anything I've done, you can get on through Amazon, through PBS, through the American Experience. And the other thing is that, new technology being what it is, you can often watch them, you can often stream them on the internet now, even from pretty far back. The second question, the letters, what a terrible thing, because these two guys, what's so wonderful about them is they wrote to friends, and some of their friends overlapped, and they wrote every day, about what they felt and what was going on in their lives. And I can't imagine being at work 40 years from now, which I will not be, but I can't imagine having to be someone at work in 40 years, trying to track down the most interesting tweets, from somebody. It is sort of a lost art.
Okay. Other questions? Wait just a second here.
Yes. In researching Mark Twain, have you encountered his relationship with Nikola Tesla?
Not yet. I have not, but I'd love to hear about it. Okay. Good. He had relationships with everybody. I mean, it's amazing the people that he bumped into.
Well, this one actually contains some dirty lemon.
Good. Let me tell you, one of the things he sent to John Hay when John Hay was the Assistant Secretary of State. Actually, it might have been Twain's friend that sent this to Hay, but it was a short story that Twain wrote that might have been the dirtiest thing written in the 19th century. It's a little ditty called 1601, and I think you could probably get it today. But it must have been illegal just to ship it through the mails, And what did Hay do? What did Hay do with it? It was privately sent to him. He sent it to a friend of his to Cleveland to have it printed for about 10 or 12 friends to ship around. Yeah.
Other questions? Surely there's some more questions. About Judge Perrin here, Tyler. You don't have to get down like that.
With all the technology that we have now, and Wikipedia and Google and all that, do people actually know any more now? Or do we just think we know more now?
What scares me is I worry that as a parent of two college students, what scares me is that our kids are going to believe that they don't have to know as much because they can always run to the computer and learn it real quick, you know? That worries me a little bit. But at the same time, you know, I run across a lot of really interested young people hungry to know things and hungry to go out and learn things and make films about them. So what I worry about a little bit is just the economics of the world, of in particular PBS, which I know, and of the book business. Fewer and fewer people are buying books. And you know, it's actually, as an author, I have to say it's slightly depressing to walk into a bookstore, you know. There's this avalanche of books, and you think, how is anybody ever going to find mine? And so people aren't buying like they used to. Budgets are going down at PBS for films, and audience is going down all the time. It was 15 years ago, if I had a film premiere on The American Experience or as a standalone on PBS, you know, the initial audience might be up 6, 8, 10, 12 million people if it was a quickly rerun. And now if I get 1.5 million, that's reason to dance for joy. So it's just that things are spreading out in different ways. It gives young people an opportunity to, you know, because of the cost of production can be very low, it gives them a chance to go out and try their own thing and make their own mistakes. What I fear about that is that they're losing a chance to learn from people who have experience and who know the craft, who can teach them before they jump in and start doing their own thing. But you know, I don't mean to be a crank about it. So. But you know, hey, Joe Biden would tell me, Mark, everything's going to be fine.
Okay, we got one over here, and then we'll get Tom.
What is the one film that you probably will never produce, but if you ever had a chance to produce it, you'd just love to?
There is one I'd really love to do, and it's because one of the reasons I did Walt Whitman was because people said, you know, I've never seen a good film about a poet. I don't think it can be done. And so I wanted to give it a shot, give it a try. And there have been good films about writers, but one documentary film I would really love to do is the life of and the work of Kurt Vonnegut, who I find to be a really interesting. And by the way, Vonnegut was in the Battle of the Bulge. Slaughterhouse-Five really grows out of his experience in the Battle of the Bulge. I actually, he was in the 106th Division, which was, you know, a division that was surrendered probably faster than any division in American history. And he was in Dresden during the firebombing, and he had to like pick bodies out of the rubble. And I actually talked with a guy who was next to him in Dresden, who was also a POW there. And you know, that book Slaughterhouse-Five grows out of that experience. But I just I think he had a real handle on the kind of the track of America that not many people know about. And I'd like to just dig in his work and his life and explore that a little bit. So, and that's the one film I'll probably never be able to do.
Okay, I know we got a question over there first, Tyler, at the back.
Are your children following in their parents' footsteps?
No, they're not running away from them, but they're not really, and we didn't sort of encourage that kind of thing. As a matter of fact, my wife is also a writer, and I think we were very discouraging at the dinner table most of the time. This is a tough way to make a living, kids. And but at the same time, that my son is not sure what he wants to do, but he's a political science major. So some of the interest in politics at least seeped in. My daughter is studying anthropology, and she can't get enough of measuring skulls. Go figure. So, although her mom, my wife, and her mom was also, I was telling someone earlier, she was an anthropology major and was working toward her PhD, and when she jumped off the academic track and ended up being a writer for many years at Rolling Stone magazine. So, I always tell them where you start is not where you're going to end up.
Have you worked with Ken Burns?
I never have worked with Ken Burns, but I'll tell you, Ken Burns really sort of opened the doors for a lot of people with the success of Civil War. Because of how successful that was and how many people that drew, it really gave a big boost. And this has been 20 years ago when I first started. There was all of a sudden a lot more money was being put into that, to historical documentaries. And American Experience always is a little, they're a little, how should I say? Well, I won't. American Experience was there before, Ken Burns' big Civil War series, and they always feel like they don't maybe get the credit they deserve. But he really did open up the field for a lot of people, and so I thank him for that. But I've never worked with him. We've worked with the same people. It's a pretty small group of folks who do what we do, so we all kind of tend to use similar sound editors and composers and sound people. So you kind of know what everybody's doing and what they're up to. I'd love to have his bank account, but other than that, yeah, I hear he's got a sports car.
This is somewhat of a broad question, but for somebody who's looking to get into the film industry, do you have any words of wisdom or pointers or tips? If for somebody
I can repeat it for you. Yeah, he's asking for someone looking to break into the film business. And there's a lot of different roads in, and there's a lot of different. I mean, the film business is a big place. So let me give you two different possibilities. One is I work with a lot of people who have they're crafts people. They have very specific crafts. They're cinematographers who are really the best at what they do, and they're sound people who know how to deliver you clean sound, and there are sound editors who do the sound work on the films that really, and composers, and those people. What happens is they learn that craft and they get very good at that one thing, and it can take them all over the world. I mean, I have friends who've traveled all over the world doing that work. It's the same thing and repetitive, but you get to see a lot of different places. I mean, the other way to go is if you're headed toward, I want to be a producer, director, writer of documentary films or of small independents or of bigger films. I worked with I hired a lot of people who came out of film school, but I also hired a lot of people who didn't, who studied other things. And then they went and they spent time learning from the bottom up. You go and you're a PA and you haul food around, but you keep your eyes open and you see what goes on a set and you see who does what. And it's a really good opportunity and hey, film crews are always looking, especially smaller independent, always looking for warm bodies who are willing to work for nothing. Or food. Maybe you can get them to pay your gas. But also, if you're interested in being a filmmaker, I always tell people the root skill is to be a storyteller. And that goes across all mediums that now exist and are being invented by people smarter than me. Who knows what holograms are going to be happening in 20 years, but they're always going to need storytellers. And you know, that's a craft you can help yourself learn on your own. You know, read good books, look at good films, see what works and what doesn't.
We have time for one more question, if anybody has one. We have one right here from Randy.
Yes, all of us have probably in this room unique stories about Bob Dole. Could tell them probably all evening long. Do you have any special or unique story that you want to tell about Bob Dole?
Yeah, let me tell this one thing that I remember, because it was the most striking, one of the most striking things I ever heard while working on the book. This was, I think it must have been Christmas time of 1988. It was the holidays, and Dole was in his office and had a little bit of extra time, and Walt Riker, who was his press secretary at the time, called up Richard and said, you know, the senator has some time for you tomorrow, so come on down. So we went and sat in his office for about 3 hours and sort of went back through the campaign. And you know, if you remember, it's a long time ago. You obviously will remember this campaign and how he came out of Iowa and it looked like he was going to be president, and he went to New Hampshire, and if he had beaten George Bush there, you know, he was on the roll, he was going, and so he was just sort of reliving that moment in the office that day. And I don't know if you remember this also, but Bush was everywhere in the state in New Hampshire that week, running around. He had his hard hat on. He was working heavy machinery, literally. Dole's talking about working heavy machinery. And he said, you know, it's the only time in my life that I ever felt I ever felt somehow disabled. You know, he didn't think that way, and so I thought that was a moment I'll always kind of remember, because that wasn't, you know, it wasn't his way of thinking, but it was just like, he was so close, you know. If there could have been one other thing that happened, right? That was it. And I remember him also saying about somebody who had that same day who had organized a different state, one which I won't say. Says, God, put him out to organize. I say, this guy couldn't organize a 2-car funeral. I mean, he was always funny. He was always funny. I also think he knew the exact amount of the guy's dry cleaning bills over the previous 2 months that had gone back to the campaign. But that was a moment as someone trying to understand, again, through the eyes of that was one of those light bulb moments. And that's the one I remember about him.
I actually know the exact person you're talking about, and Bob Dole is absolutely correct. Mark, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This was terrific.